saw toward the end of the year really one of the beginning of a large-scale attack on an organization that is a large provider of genomic data and applications, and that being the compromise and attack on 23andMe. And I think that you look at that and think, what are the implications of that? That's an area where that's pretty immutable data. Like you can't go change your bank account, you can't go change your DNA. And so there's some concern about, what are the longer term implications on that? And are there ways in which we can better manage and protect both the security and privacy of genomic information?
Welcome to another episode of Mandiant's Defender's Advantage podcast. I'm your host, Luke McNamara, and I'm excited today to be joined by Taylor Lehmann, Director in Google Cloud's Office of the CISO, and Bill Reid, Security Advisor, also in Google Cloud's Office of the CISO, where both of them do a lot of work with our customers in the healthcare and life sciences space. So, Taylor, Bill, great to have you with us here today.
Great to be here. Thanks, Luke.
Yeah, thanks, Luke. Looking forward to the conversation.
So every now and then we'd like to do episodes that kind of spotlight or showcase some of the unique challenges or perspectives in a given industry. Today, because of both of your backgrounds, having been CISOs in the healthcare, pharma, life sciences space, and the work that you currently do here at Google Cloud, that's really what we're going to be talking about. But I think some of these themes will have applicability, obviously, to listeners in any industry or sector. What I thought we could begin with, though, is looking back at last year, at 2023, thinking about the healthcare life sciences space as an industry. What were some of the larger industry and sector trends and shifts that you saw that potentially had downstream impacts on kind of the security landscape or things that for folks in those industries they had to kind of reckon with that may have impacted their work, just sort of organizational larger trends that were happening last year?
Yeah, I think there is a variety of ways one could answer this question. There was a lot of activity on the regulatory front. A number of new laws and regulations kicked in or were proposed for adoption this year and into next. Interesting stuff like most recently trying to solve some of the historical challenges of funding healthcare cybersecurity through some creative reimbursement strategies here in the U.S. I'm referring to, the proposal to start reimbursing health systems for patient services, basing that reimbursement in part on the security of the facility as demonstrated. And there's still many, many sort of details to be worked out. But for the first time, we're seeing people tie business outcomes to security outcomes from a regulatory perspective. So that's super neat. Many CISOs in industry also very excited to see the sort of adoption and implementation of increased security standards for medical devices. That sort of goes in part with the increased number of attacks we're seeing on those things. It's one of definitely the top 5 trends from a threat perspective was attackers going after that specific equipment. I'd also add all of the major supply chain attacks that we saw this year directly affected health systems. The Okta, Progress ones in particular were so widespread. They definitely had downstream impacts on not just the health systems and the payers and the life sciences and the biotech companies, but also their patients and their ability to get information from those organizations through identities that were managed or services that were facilitated through some of that software. So, the supply chain played big. Ransomware, always top of the list, continues to be the whole triple threat of sort of hack, extort the organizations, affect their availability, and then, threaten to leak information publicly. We're starting, again, ransomware continues to evolve. The thing that I think most folks know about healthcare, things that make us really special are the patient data we have, and it really motivates ransomware actors to go after that in particular. And then, of course, anything I say on this topic has to include the use of AI, both in defense and in offense, and starting to see attackers grow more sophisticated with it, as well as defenders growing more sophisticated using it. That seem to be really, really top of mind to me this year as well as going into next.
I think I'll add to that with a couple things. One is particularly in kind of the pharmaceutical space and pharmaceutical manufacturing, kind of increasing amounts of kind of cyber physical interface connecting industrial control systems in the production facilities to networks, and how is that going to be properly managed? In many cases, the old-fashioned boundaries between physical security, cybersecurity, and industrial security are really, those kinds of hard divisions are going away. This notion of, I'm going to be well protected. My manufacturing operations will be well protected by air gapping, really a bit of a myth. The interdependencies between IT systems, for example, impacting OT, whether it's ordering systems, supply systems, staffing, et cetera. If I take out one, there's an interdependency. So even if I don't hit the OT networks, by taking out or disrupting one of the other systems, I can really affect the ability to manufacture product. I think that the other is that we saw toward the end of the year really one of the beginning of a large scale attack on an organization that is a large provider of genomic data and applications, and that being the compromise and attack on 23andMe. And I think that you look at that and think, what are the implications of that? That's an area where that's pretty immutable data. Like you can't go change your bank account, you can't go change your DNA. And so there's some concern about, what are the longer term implications on that, and are there ways in which we can better manage and protect both the security and privacy of genomic information. And I think that we're going to see some increasing activity there, and I think that we'll see how things play out in that space. But I do think that large biobanks, the protection of large biobanks of genomics databases, that sort of thing, are going to be pretty important. It's not only important, I think, from just the privacy risks for the individuals, but these are increasingly going to be data sources that may be used for providing model refinement and foundational model training for AI, particularly as we're looking to apply AI in compound and drug discovery processes. We have to know that data has integrity, hasn't been compromised, and in and of itself has a tremendous amount of intellectual property. So those are some areas I think that we saw, kind of the emergence of, and we're still kind of thinking through what are the implications of all of that.
So moving from sort of the larger industry trends, and really even when we say industry, and we're kind of talking about a couple different pieces of this larger sector, everything from the providers and the healthcare professionals at hospitals, some of the research that's being done in academia, in pharmaceutical organizations, different business models, different types of data, potentially at risk or potential to get targeted by different types of threat actors. When we think about, and we've talked about this through a lot of last year with customers in the space, we think about some of the intel themes and topics that came up last year. So threats that we saw from a range of different actors, a range of different sets of activity they were engaging in. You have things like the extortive activity we saw from ransomware affiliated actors using things like Alfie ransomware, the continued trend around data leaks as a means of extortion. You had the KillNet collective that was very active, especially at the first part of last year, DDoSing hospitals, in Europe. And we saw Ankh 4841, suspected Chinese APT espionage actor that in a number of the different sectors and verticals that were targeting, healthcare was impacted in some of their operations, right? All three of those are very different types of threats. So how do you think about when you were seeing these stories kind of come up and some of the others you mentioned earlier, how do you think about those different types of threats and the risks they pose to different parts of this ecosystem?
So I think for me, it really reinforces this notion of we have to be thinking about countermeasuring a broad set of risks, right? So if we kind of just aim and say, hey, we're going to do everything to thwart ransomware, and we overload in one set of controls, we're leaving ourselves a little exposed, right? I think the challenge right now in this space is that the diversity and variety of those types of threat actors and TTPs that are being applied, these tactics, techniques, and procedures that are being applied, are really stretching. They're stretching organizations' capacity to think carefully and control all of the assets. And one of the things, particularly in the healthcare delivery side of things, is it's a very large surface area. These are, large complex institutions in which, patients come in and go out. A variety of employees and contractors come in and go out. There's medical devices that are used. There's a variety of lab systems that are used. There's EHRs. There's all kinds of different systems. And so we have to be thinking and modeling threats, and the diversity of those threats across a pretty complicated asset portfolio. I think that it can sometimes, as a CISO or people responsible for the security operations in an organization, it can feel like you're getting hit from all different directions, and in fact, you might be getting hit from all different directions. And we need to be thinking really about good foundational hygiene. I think, if anything, I'm even more convinced about the need for fundamental good security hygiene, things like really good and strong identity and access control, identity management, access control, authorization processes, really good backup and restore and business continuity planning, kind of foundational hardening on sets of services, really good telemetry, and having the capability of data collection, log aggregation, and analysis, and enrichment of that analysis to make sense of it all. I think those kinds of nuts and bolts, really basic execution, is even more important now, and gives kind of foundational resilience to these organizations.
I would tack on, and I think this is something that is becoming more and more obvious. Most of the healthcare industry globally has been, for some might say, fortunately, I might be a little bit less optimistic and say, unfortunately, really focused on protecting confidentiality of the data. And when as Bill mentioned, for those of us who've been in this industry for a long time, the focus has really been bent towards confidentiality of information. But if you look at the attacks that you talked about, KillNet being a good example, and really anything related to ransomware, these are really attacks on the availability of systems, that in many cases, and certainly the case in the U.S., these systems, the ones I'm talking about, are considered critical, national infrastructure. If their availability is impacted, one could argue it has a much larger impact on many more people than, say, the confidentiality of say the patients themselves. And when I'm talking about impact, I'm talking about not so much embarrassment of, say, information getting out or into the hands of an attacker. I'm talking about a critical health system in the middle of nowhere being taken down and given patients and people in those communities no other option to seek and obtain care. And so, that's been a concerning trend. I think that's been growing for years. I think shifting focuses to, again, to the broader threats, but really focusing on more like what are these outcomes that we can't handle. And I think, sadly, we've been okay handling, for the majority, most confidentiality breaches. People seem to not always move on. In most cases, some sort of remediation, and over time, the impact of those events on individuals goes down and down. Except definitely in the case of the 23andMe, where acquiring genomic data could lead to all sorts of interesting and unfortunate outcomes, especially if that information is weaponized in ways I don't want to go into, but as one could imagine. But I think the shift from confidentiality to availability is perhaps the more important outcome. I think is something we really need to think about and design systems for, equally, if not in some cases, as a more important priority than necessarily confidentiality. Now, in the other case where I would say confidentiality continues to be high and probably is going higher, is as supported by the Young 4841 analysis that was done, and certainly other examples, is this like going after the intellectual property of say drug makers and manufacturers and others, where these molecular compounds and chemicals that we're engineering to treat civilizations, both for illnesses as well as a mechanism increasingly being used as a deterrent of sorts, and something that's being looked at as more important to national security. You're starting to see attacks on organizations like drug manufacturers, specifically for the purposes of obtaining intellectual property to further whatever that attacker, or in some cases nation states, goals are. Certainly in the case of like China, we see this quite a bit. They've got a very large population of people to manage. They've got all sorts of threats, and having a strong biomanufacturing, drug making, pharmaceutical industry is really important to not only the safety of their society, but also as potentially a threat to other societies as well. So seeing the shift there, the confidentiality moving away from personal information to secrets of these organizations is also something we need to factor into our thinking more and more. But just to close on that availability point, which I think is really important. I mentioned having to architect systems for availability. Many of us who've worked in healthcare for a long time know that building strong and resilient systems, in many cases distributed systems or ephemeral systems, which are the ones that seem to do best and stay most resilient in the wake of, say, a denial of service attack or somebody taking out one end of a system or another, those can be expensive. Those can be impossible depending on the technology you're using. So I'm, like I said earlier, going back to like looking at the fundamentals of how health systems are funded and how they prioritize that spending to acquire and then build resilient systems, I think is one of the most important security priorities that these organizations really need to start thinking about more and more. I don't feel good that governments are having to compel us to do this for our health systems, but I think we're at the point now where we're seeing that it's necessary and important, not just for the individual, but for the society at whole.
Just to kind of echo that availability versus confidentiality, I think one of the things that's really striking for me is that what we've gone from is a situation in which a confidentiality breach has an impact on individual patients over time. And it tends to be kind of a private harm. But what we're seeing when we have availability attacks, where we're taking out the ability to deliver services or stop ambulatory surgery or shut down a department that's delivering care, I think now we're starting to hurt people more quickly, right? So that's a situation in which the attacker is actually potentially causing much more direct harm. It's not reputational or financial harm, it's actually physical harm. And I think that's really a disturbing trend. And I think it also has a very destabilizing social impact, where people are feeling not quite sure about the reliability of services that they've come to count on, and the pride that we've had in the ability for healthcare in the United States to be pretty available and ubiquitous. And so I think that's a very destabilizing nature of an attack that both can be quickly harmful, but also socially disruptive.
Yeah, it seems very similar to what we've seen in other sectors and industries as organizations have tried to wrestle with the impact that we've seen from extortive threat actors, particularly in the ransomware space, especially over the last 3 or 4 years, as we've started to see this become more and more prevalent. And as the tactics have shifted to not just involve ransomware, but data theft as a means of extortion as well. Those disruptive attacks are a lot harder. They're one much more noticeable. People typically see when those organizations have been impacted by something like ransomware. It's a lot harder to keep quiet. But it seems like, particularly within the healthcare space, there's a much direct, much clearer linkage often, at least to the potential impact of loss of life and harm. And I think there's increasingly, we're seeing more studies that are looking at the impact, for example, on ambulance services at hospitals that have been impacted with ransomware, and where that has some implications on patient well-being. But I think it's also interesting, going back to your point earlier about genomic data security, that does seem to be as there's kind of the shift more on availability or focus on that because of the very immediate and real threat that presents, sort of the long tail impact on some of these sets of data, how that could be taken and potentially misused. That's very different than, say, IP being stolen and a rival, product comes on the market maybe years down the road, which is certainly an impact, to that organization. But there's kind of these niche areas where that threat or impact to human well-being is maybe unique compared to other sectors and the types of data that exist.
Totally. I just had like the second and third order impacts. That's what you're talking about, right? Like, at one point in time, yeah, the genomic data was just valuable to have, right? Just for whatever immediate purposes there were. And then somebody looked at it and said, well, wait a second, there's a middle term and a longer term use of it that I could monetize or use to achieve whatever outcome I was after, whether it be biosecurity of a certain population or the ability to predict what's coming, or the ability, from genetic information that could be acquired on large groups of people. It could be also used to prioritize what we need to be ready to defend against. There's 0 days all over the place in that stuff. If you really think hard enough about it, there's all sorts of interesting uses that we haven't even come up with. And those second and third order attacks are scary. I totally agree with Bill. Like, even the future of how technology will be used, irregardless of the attack. Like, much of the data that's being used to train models and some of this new AI are going to be the same data, potentially acquired from interesting different places. And its integrity and its quality and its completeness are also going to be interesting problems to focus on. And the ones I'm thinking about are like, that 23andMe data potentially could be repackaged and resold. It could be incomplete. It could then be used to develop conclusions about the effectiveness of a drug, which then could be made and produced and kill a bunch of people on accident because the data is bad, or intentionally poisoned and then resold to a target organization for some other nefarious purpose, right? There's all sorts of weird things that could happen. I think, to the broader point you're making, though, is attackers starting to think about these second and third order attacks, looking at some of the sort of assets they've been able to acquire. Also, just getting more experience dealing with victims and seeing how the victims react. Like a great example, you probably all remember early in the pandemic, there were ransomware groups that came out and said, we're not going to attack hospitals because they're kind of keeping us alive right now. And there were a good number of, health systems. I wasn't at one of them because we don't believe criminals when they try to tell us things that they believe are true. But there was a certain number of folks who said, oh, thank goodness that that threat actor just said that they're not going to target hospitals because that's a nice thing for them to do right now. And I always say, like, criminals are going to be criminaling. Like, that's the thing they're great at, and lying is one of them. And yet that was like the first indication that, hey, attackers kind of know, they're paying attention to the industries that they're attacking. They understand what can be used to get the greatest return. That, this notion that there are rules around who can be and who cannot be attacked, that I also thought was fascinating too. And to connect this to a point I'll try to make much more quickly is, if you look at the sort of the FBI's takedown of Black Cat towards the end of this year, Black Cat was really upset. It seemed like they were not feeling great that at least part of their infrastructure was compromised, and they lost like $70 million, I think the number was, or close to it, in terms of ransom payments that they were set to receive because the FBI acquired decryption keys and sent them to victim orgs. And in response to that attack, I mean, they very clearly came out and said, hey, we're taking the gloves off on critical infrastructure, power systems, sewage, water treatment, and hospital and healthcare. Like, those are fair game now. Like it's amazing to me that they were ever considered off limits, because no one ever actually did. But now the call is being put out by some of the more sophisticated and successful groups to say, hey, that's fair game. And that tit for tat piece to it is an interesting element too. But just going back to this broader point, like, attackers know this. They've known it for a long time. Folks who think that'll never happen to them if you're working in this industry are not paying attention enough to the now very direct and loud signal these groups are sending. And whether they're lying or not, it's very clear that they know what they're talking about.
Yeah, and I think, sometimes we forget that there's different motivations. There could be a threat actor who's very motivated to hit a specific target for a particular financial return. There's others that are interested in hitting an industry in order to change the competitive landscape. But there's also threat actors who are trying to destabilize national governments and political systems, and cause and sow doubt among a populace and cause division. And one way of doing that is go hit some of those critical infrastructures, particularly those that are associated with providing care to a population. And I think, we have to kind of remember that people are operating in with a variety of different motivations, and it might not necessarily be always so clear. So, the industry itself may be used for and attacks in that industry used for larger purposes and political reasons.
And I go back to this like notion of like availability has got to be one. Privacy, like Josh Corman, who, if he's going to listen to this podcast, will hopefully fist pump and say, like we need to kind of adopt the mindset that, I care more about my safety and my life safety than I do necessarily about my privacy. And I'm not saying that's a good thing to have to say, but if you ask most people, say, look, would you rather have a computer system that's there to treat you actually harm you, or would you rather have your records be lost? If you could pick one of the two, what would you pick as an outcome that you'd prefer to avoid? I think most people would say, I'd rather not be the victim of a cyber attack that results in my death.
Yeah, I think that point that Taylor raises here is something that we really saw as a watershed this year, which was really the recognition of the importance of security and cybersecurity to the quality and safety of healthcare devices and systems. Like it really was this shift from, hey, we just don't want to have disclosure and breaches, to no, actually security is necessary for us to actually deliver safe and effective care. And that was really a large intent and driver behind what we saw with the FDA's requirements in Section 524B of the Food and Drug and Cosmetic Act. It was like an amendment to that act that said, hey, look, we really see the importance of security as a critical element to delivering high quality product. And you can't have reliable, high quality, safe, effective product if you don't have cybersecurity. And that was really a watershed, I think, for the industry this year. And I think we're going to see more of that as we head into the
especially with AI playing a massive role in the next wave of tech innovation. It's going to compound.
So let's shift a little bit with these as kind of the intel themes, the threat themes that we saw last year, and get into that sort of operationalization with that sort of threat intel and knowledge. So looking at things like third-party risk assessments, vulnerability management, patch management, threat modeling. How do you think about taking some of these concepts and these themes, particularly on the intel side, and then feeding that into, again, TPRM, phone management, threat modeling, how that all applies?
I'm not sure that everyone would agree with me in this statement, but I think there's a lot of noise that exists within the intel that we're getting that wouldn't otherwise exist and make the intel we're getting more effective if we were still producing reports into 2024 that said weak and stolen passwords continue to be the number one issue that these organizations need to fix. So like before I get into like, what we learned or what we should be doing as countermeasures to these things, like the basic hygiene stuff, I know it's not fun to talk about, but it still represents a huge percentage of how the bad things start and how the bad things spread. And just because somebody has two-factor authentication, it's been proven this year that there are bad ways to do that. Even though you might have it, there are ways to implement those controls that are not good. And that organizations have gotten hit time and time again by implementing controls to address weak credentials with poorly implemented controls. So there's a notion of making sure that not only are we covering off on the basics, but we are making sure that the basics are working effectively over time. And I think that holds true for everything, but especially in those things. Because if we don't start these conversations with like, get control of identity, identity is the first thing that goes wrong. And if you're in the cloud, identity could mean you just get deleted off the internet like quickly. If one bad credential gets popped, and similar effects on systems that aren't on cloud. But that seems to me to still be the clear control priority here, and that organizations who think they're done are probably not done. We saw plenty of evidence of that Um, uh, Now, to shift gears a little bit, I think you mentioned TPRM, third-party risk management. I think we need to expand beyond the spreadsheet checklist questionnaire that defenders are using to get an understanding of what their third parties are doing and where they're acquiring technology from. We need to start looking up and down the supply chains for where the data, especially for AI, where the data is coming from, how we can ensure that the data we're using to build models and to run our business is effective. The same for code, and not just that the vendors got a SOC 2, but like we know everything about the product that we're bringing into our environment or sending our data to. The expectations are higher now. They've always been high, frankly, but we're understanding why they're high in much more acute ways. So getting control of your software supply chain, obviously critical. And for all of that, it starts with visibility into those risks. And then when countermeasures are applied, making sure those countermeasures are working. Like it's no longer allowed where you can take the spreadsheet that you had the vendor fill out about what their security controls were and shove it in the desk drawer and never look at it again. Like we have to get to a point where we're continuously validating our beliefs in the software we're acquiring, the data that's coming into our networks, the controls that are in place both at your vendor as well as in your organization that touch those things and keep them, trustworthy. Um, I think even some more advanced topics we haven't really started to talk about more, but starting to approach the TPRM space is saying, look, we're going to find ways to do business with vendors that don't require us to trust them at all. Like don't send your data elsewhere. Have those services come and run within the environment you control. If people need to access to your data, bring them into isolated environments in your environment to do it where you control the game, where you understand what the controls are, and you don't have to outsource that visibility to anyone else. So I think there's hopefully through security there's going to be a shift here where we adopt some of these not zero trust in the traditional sense approaches, but we start to truly architect no trust required relationships and corresponding ways of doing work.
And I would say that if you take those topics of TPRM, vulnerability patch management, and threat modeling, that in some respects they can be encapsulated even in looking at what the FDA's recent guidance um, asks of the medical device industry, and so if kind of walk it this way, one, it said, hey, we really want secure by design, and that begins with really good threat modeling and control enumeration and description. And so you got to do that to have a medical device approved. Second, when that device is out in the market and it's now in operation, you better have a vulnerability and patch management operational process and discipline in place as a medical device manufacturer. And you better do that in concert with the delivery system where those devices are deployed. And we expect to see evidence and controls and programs built around that. And then the last was in this TPRM, they put a heavy emphasis on one, knowing your suppliers, but to describe what is in your software in the form of a software bill of materials or an SBOM requirement. And so to be very transparent in the labeling of those products with what are the constituent parts that make up your product. And so if you look at, just take the example, the microcosm of the FDA's medical device regulations, we're seeing evidence of each of those being expressed as requirements or to be commercially viable. Like you want to be out in the market, you got to go do all those three things. Like you got to hit all of those. And I think that I think we're going to see a pattern of that. We've kind of looked at each of these in isolation, and I think what for me the FDA's rules represented was in some respects a coalescing of a bunch of those different parts into really a single set of guidance. I would expect to see that being applied in the delivery space. I would expect to see that being applied in other FDA regulated production like drug manufacturing, where there'll be a requirement to think more holistically across the full product life cycle, and to think about how does security come in right from the beginning of the design process all the way through the ultimate decommissioning of whatever that is. And that we have to be thinking more comprehensively about it and thinking about all of those handoffs. I think what really struck me as pretty interesting is recognizing the kind of interdependency and the shared fate that exists between the medical device manufacturers and the deployers of their technology. It's not like, hey, you just go design this box that's secure, this instrument or whatever. No, you have to actually think about the environment and the control capabilities of the environment in which that device is going to be deployed. And you better describe for us how you've thought about that and how you know that. And I think that that's going to drive a kind of a set of collaboration that is going to be a bit new. And I think adding that, cloud service providers that are supporting that software as a medical device are another part of that mix. And we're all going to have to be kind of teaming up and sharing how we are going to help compensate the controls of the other parties and be collaborative in that process. And I think I'm optimistic that, we'll see an improvement in that and a little bit less of people acting in isolation and being able to be picked off by attackers. I think that really is the ultimately, kind of, dare I say, the defender's advantage, is the ability to kind of come together and really understand collaboratively how we're going to provide compensating defense. So I'm bullish. I'm not thinking that the attackers are giving up in any regard, but I do think we're gonna get a little bit wiser about maybe seeing the interconnections and the ways we can help each other.
I would add the collaboration stuff is stuff we talk about a lot at Google. We take it really seriously. We're members of a number of international intel sharing communities. Bill and I and many Googlers spend a lot of time, say, for example, with the Health ISAC and the Bio ISAC and some of the international offshoots. Collaboration is definitely the thing that I think is getting better and is definitely an area where we're seeing productive gains being made in I'd say increasing amounts. I also think orgs like Google recognize we have a responsibility here too, to not only participate and collaborate, but also to co-develop and co-build solutions and guidance that make defenders' jobs easier, especially those who choose to deploy technology on our respective platforms. And not to foreshadow too much, but we're working on quite a few things that we think the industry will value greatly, in future periods. But I would say definitely optimism prevails here, and I think we are ultimately getting better. I think I'll really know and see. I'll know when I see it, but when we start leading conversations around the security of the things we place trust in that start with a threat model, that start with, we thought about what could go wrong and here's what we've done about it, as opposed to any other way to establish trust in anything. I think that'll be the difference in the world that I'll really be excited to see, and I think will really tell us that we're going down the path that we should be going down here.
Well, that's a great segue into, as we wrap things up here, what are some things that both of you guys are keeping an eye on or following? Could be larger trends in the industry. I don't know if you're expecting to see, a lot of M&A activity this year, which has, an impact obviously in the cyberspace, or certain threat trends, or some of these regulatory changes that are coming down the road. But any particular things that you guys are keeping an eye on, and for anyone that wants to follow the space or maybe works in this industry, that they should also be monitoring this year?
I mean, I think if you just look at where the money's being spent right now by large governments, you'll find that it's on safety, which as Bill mentioned, is strongly overlaps with security. And so you're going to start to see products being taken off market. You're going to start seeing increased fines and penalties. You'll also see greater and greater investment by adversaries into discovery of things that threaten safety. So I think safety, and in the medical world, it's really closely tied to this concept of quality engineering, right? Like really thinking through building technology with long-term protection thought of is an area of focus, hopefully of an area of investment by private industry, certainly an industry, certainly investment by public sector agencies. But safety as it relates to security and quality are all sort of interesting to me. And then the I guess closely related, but and I'm sure this will be Bill's answer too, so I'm going to take credit for stealing his before he even says it, is the crazy speed at which we are adopting and using artificial intelligence and machine learning in every aspect in every sector of the health industry, from treating patients to imagining and discovering drugs. Like, there is so much work going into and so much money being spent on these foundation models, AI platforms, hardware, software, you name it, to take advantage of this technology. And the fact that we're so early on, and everything is breaking, and we're able to break so many things. It feels like we're back in, the year 2000, when the internet was just kind of coming of age, and people discovered application security was important. And yeah, if you put, the right set of characters into an input field, you could own an entire system. Like, we're back in those days, but now it's AI, that's breaking easily and everywhere. And, I'm interesting. I'm really interested to see how we as defenders are imagining new and creative ways of using things like model retraining and reusing things like input and output filtering to start to get our arms around securing models and data pipelines and the supply chain that goes into that. I'm also really interested in not for in the same way as where the new attack vectors will be and how creative uh, attackers are and defenders are in predicting and mitigating, attacks on things like foundation models. Because foundation models are going to be, if there's anything that keeps me up at night, it's the security of these foundation models. These are going to be the models that train the next models, and the models after that, and the models after that, and the models after that. It's like genomic data. Like, it's not going to change. It's only going to be built on and built on and built on. And this whole thought around transitive vulnerabilities or transitive weaknesses in models that build other models, especially in healthcare, are things that I think are trends I'm keeping an eye out for, things I'm trying to read and learn as much about as I can, and then defensive mechanisms that work.
I would say it's all going to be about how do we use AI as a security tool, and how do we build and extend foundational models to do security tasks. How do we infuse AI into products and security products to make sense of large volumes of information? I I think that's where it's all going to be, where a lot of attention is going to be over the next year, 2 years. I think the other piece is just, you know, a lot of CISOs that I've talked to have expressed interest and concern around just governance. How do we think about the governance models? How do they evolve with the introduction of a new set of capabilities in the business? And how do they execute their stewardship responsibility for security in light of those technologies? And I think that's going to be evolving, that and then everybody's watching what's happening in regulation and government action, and trying to understand uh, where things are headed. And it's I think that's where we're going to see a lot of activity, and I think it's going to be a, a good balancing act for a lot of CISOs out there.
Well, that's a great place to end it on. Taylor, Bill, this has been a great, enlightening conversation. Thanks for sharing your perspectives. I'm looking forward to doing more and partnering with you guys here at Google Cloud this year. So take care and enjoy the rest of your day.